The Road Home, a contemporary exploration of the Buddhist path, written by Ethan Nichtern, read by Naomi Kirst-Schultz. This is part 1 of chapter 2, Karma, Taking Responsibility for Home. When we start to work with our mind in a consistent, rigorous, and disciplined way, we start to become more and more familiar with our own conditioning and habitual patterns of thought and behavior. We see the patterns of our mind more clearly when we slow down and look at them through meditation. The study of our habitual conditioning and how habit leads us to react is the study of karma. On the meditation cushion, these patterns often manifest as recurrent thoughts or fantasies, or more subtly, as a certain inner tone of voice that comments on our experience. Karma has become quite a loaded term in the modern Western lexicon and is one of the most co-opted ideas from all of Eastern philosophy. Even among Buddhist philosophical schools, the idea is talked about in many different ways. There are pithy teachings and immensely complicated explanations of human cognition. One of the problematic approaches to karma evolves from a materialistic point of view, in which karma is portrayed as some kind of commodified spiritual account, a kind of credit line extended by the bank of the cosmos for good deeds we've done. While this kind of quote-unquote credit score outlook can lead a person to actually engage in positive behavior, the reasons for doing so are often suspect. Karma becomes most relevant if we simply examine it as a psychology of habit. Karma is about beginning to see the general script we act from, the strategies we employ when confronted with familiar obstacles along our commute. This approach to studying karma as our acquired habitual patterns is much more practical and useful since, in adopting it, we avoid the danger of a spiritually materialistic belief system, where we are constantly acting with ulterior motives to maximize quote-unquote good karma, trying to rig the roulette wheel of circumstance, betting on actions that lead to pleasure and engaging in ethical behavior only because we think, if I do the right thing, then the universe owes me one. Simply put, karma is not your cosmic bank account, and it's not a Las Vegas casino either. Another difficulty with this subject, however, is that it can induce feelings of great guilt and shame. We often view karma as some indictment for all the awful things that have happened to us, and all the awful things that have happened in this world. For example, after hearing a bit about karma as a child, I remember thinking that as someone with asthma, I must have done something terrible in a past life to not be able to breathe very well sometimes. That kind of blame the victim approach offers us a convenient new narrative for the recurring story of our self-aggression, as well as a reason to continue to isolate ourselves from the plight of others. In this ultra-separatist approach, if bad things happen to other people, then they probably deserve them and I can't help them anyway. I have even heard friends who were mugged being told with some pseudo-spiritual logic that they got mugged because it was their karma. In a world of oppression and conflict, what a horribly demeaning view that is. At this extreme, karma becomes a kind of spiritual libertarianism, a way to praise the privileged and blame the oppressed. This kind of isolated worldview cannot hold up when we look at the larger, interdependent forces that shape our world, and when we recognize that everything and everyone's actions are affecting each other all the time, that nobody lives in a vacuum of their own making. There is a huge difference between saying that we are implicated in everything that happens to us and saying that what happens to us is our fault. The former is a statement of accountability necessary for our awakening, while the second is a statement of blame, which is completely besides the point. We spend so much time in this life trying to figure out who is at fault. Maybe it's the government's fault, but probably it's our parents' fault. We may have had very confused or absent parents, but the truth of interdependence dictates that our situation can't just be our parents' fault, for the simple fact that our parents had parents. Our grandparents had parents too, so if we place blame on our ancestry, then we may have to go all the way back to the Paleolithic era before we figure out where the first screw-up occurred, from which human society became a tragic comedy of errors. When we stay in touch with interdependence, we also stay in touch with the larger systemic forces of greed and hatred that oppress whole groups of people on this planet. It does not weaken the work of caring about social justice to also say that we need to take responsibility for the conditioning in our own heart and mind, and how we as individuals react to circumstances. When we stop asking the question, whose fault is it, and start asking the question, how can I work with this now? Then, we are truly stepping onto the path of taking responsibility for our karma. When we move beyond the materialistic view and also overcome a shame and blame way of exploring the topic, karma becomes a way to take responsibility for our true home. Acknowledging karma is meant to both empower and challenge us simultaneously, to invite us to open our eyes to the fact that our experience of events is rarely pure and straightforward. Perception is usually filtered through our habitual reactions and the biased scripts and storylines to which we have become numb. In the classical teachings on the journey of self-awareness, Hinayana in the Tibetan system, taking responsibility for one's own karma is called renunciation, rising above and renouncing samsara, the cycles of mindless habit. Renunciation is an attitude slowly cultivated over time, a commitment that begins as an intellectual understanding. We first gain some idea that the commuter's story leads nowhere but around and around, and we slowly come to realize that commuting through life, objectifying and grasping after home is not going to help us or anyone else. Renunciation is a negative phrase for overcoming a habit of not taking responsibility for our karma. But for every negative phrase in Buddhism, there is also a positive approach. For me, the best positive language for describing renunciation is, quote, taking responsibility for our true home, our own mind, unquote. In this way, we use the language of empowerment rather than negation to describe what this path is really about. If we are able to take responsibility for our own mind, then we can work with whatever life throws at us, without resentment or blame, and with the curiosity and self-care that are necessary for mindfulness to develop in all aspects of life. On this basis, we can also help others. Before we talk about the present moment, though, we have to look at the past. What follows is a fairly detailed explanation from the Buddhist tradition of the earliest framework for examining a karmic pattern. This 12-step process is known as the 12 nidanas, or 12 links in the chain of habitual cause and effect. These 12 stages divide into the past, present, and future of a habitual pattern, or karmic act. Knowing the past. Reflection on our story. A crucial question arises on the journey of self-awareness. If we seek some kind of transformation in our present and future, then how important is understanding the story of what happened in our past? Western psychologies, especially psychoanalysis, attachment theory, and related disciplines, place great importance on learning about the relational histories that dominated our early development and seeing how those patterns might play out in the present. In Buddhist terms, we can think of these examinations as knowing the roots of our karma, our habitual conditioning, and knowing how those root narratives and relationships affect our current ability to feel at home in our own heart-mind. At first glance, placing a strong emphasis on understanding our past story might seem outside the Buddhist paradigm because Buddhist practice emphasizes working directly with the experience and behaviors of the present moment over everything else. But, from the standpoint of interdependent cause and effect, this separation between understanding our past story and experiencing the present fully is a false separation, one that needs to be overcome. It's true that Buddhist practice rightfully emphasizes mindful recognition and action in the present moment, because the present moment is the only place where the real power to work with our life lies. The present moment will always be key, because in truth it's the only thing that exists. However, the Buddha clearly taught in his very early teachings on karma that understanding how the past affects our mind is the foundation for seeing how we experience ourselves now. Therefore, Buddhist practice offers many methods and contemplations for reflecting on the past in order to achieve insight, forgiveness, and healing, and more important, to offer us the ability to be ready when our habits strike us right now. The Shambhala teachings also repeatedly emphasize the importance of coming to terms with and even honoring our ancestral lineages, our family histories, our parents, and the culture in which we were raised. In Shambhala, honoring our human past is a central endeavor. We honor our lineages in order to heal our wounds, as well as to gain confidence in our humanity, and to pass that confidence, along with perhaps just a tiny bit less neurosis and self-sabotage, on to future generations. In short, while our power to act always lies in the present moment, that power is always based on understanding what came before. But what happens if we dwell on the story of our past, spending all our time recounting the details of our history to anyone who will listen? For a practitioner, the main problem with dwelling too much on the past is that it can lead to an obsession with a certain storyline, a kind of internal screenwriter's fixation that could take us away from working directly with our experience in the present moment. Instead, if we reflect on the past with the clear intention to illuminate our experience in the present, and we learn through both our own meditation practice and guidance from others how to let go of our tight grip on the past narrative at the exact point the mind begins to fixate on it, then our understanding of the relation between past and present can come into balance and harmony. The teachings on karma demonstrate a very important point about the past. The fundamental force behind our conditioning isn't stupidity or evil, nor is it a flaw in our genetic design. We adopt habitual patterns to begin with as the result of misperception or a lack of awareness. If we view the root of the problem as a misperception about the nature of experience, then forgiveness is always possible. We can rise out of feeling ashamed at our habitual confusion. According to the tradition, confusion has happened to every sentient being that has ever existed. We have to forgive ourselves for being stuck in habits and addictions, for being caught up in commute. Working with karma is something that everyone has to go through. None of us are free of conditioning. If there were really such an immaculate birth, a person born without karma, that person wouldn't serve much purpose as an example for those of us who have things that we need to work through. Having something to work through is actually something to celebrate. Having karma is almost a synonym for being human. For this reason, as he was developing the Shambhala teachings, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche gave a very hopeful and optimistic spin to the notion of karma and habitual patterns of behavior, referring to the totality of our karma as our quote-unquote cocoon. Many psychological traditions have noticed that a given behavior pattern was originally a helpful strategy for survival, a strategy that may no longer apply in the present. If you were bullied in the 7th grade, there might be a block in your hometown or city where the bullies used to wait for you, and even as an adult, your sense memories might cause you to hesitate before walking confidently down that block. This is definitely true for me, having grown up in New York City. Thus, we have to acknowledge that every habit contains a kind of protective intelligence, a wisdom that somehow got frozen in a bygone time. The silk moth uses a cocoon for protection during a necessary period of transformation until it's ready to emerge. Seeing karma as a cocoon is a beautiful way to slowly make friends with even the darkest parts of our habits, to understand the unfolding process of living, rather than to feel shame that we aren't perfect. In the positive light of the Shambhala teachings, karma is nothing more than the recurrent freezing of our past intelligence, a process that ignores the fluidity of actual experience as well as the truth of impermanence. We never fall in love the same way twice. We never meet the same bully again, and the experience of every cup of coffee is unique. No defensive strategy works the same way more than once. However, in order to feel safe and at home in our experience, we try to use our karmic cocoons to control every new moment. Thus, we reify karma by solidifying habitual strategies that preemptively filter our perceptions and manipulate our reaction to whatever happens. This is understandable. Whoever in the history of this universe or any other has not wanted to feel safe? Who wants to get bullied? Given the groundless nature of life, attempting to feel safe is the smartest thing a sentient being can do. So while examining our habits may give us a painful doorway into our harmful histories, it also gives us a chance to see that our thoughts and actions are actually made of a kind of innate intelligence. The first stage in every cycle of karmic habituation is called avidya, a word that often gets translated as ignorance, but that really means something like without knowledge or lacking awareness. Misperception is my preferred translation. What is the nature of our misperception? Why did we misperceive in the first place? In many mythologies, gods are invoked to explain the origin of various aspects of our human experience. A Buddhist creation myth, on the other hand, might simply try to tell the origin story of how our confused predicament came about. This story doesn't necessarily occur at the dawn of time, in the midst of the primordial soup, but instead recurs at each moment and in each lifetime. The karmic story of misperception is the creation tale of how our perceptual process accidentally separates that which is not inherently separate. On the deepest level of consciousness, misperception involves the experience of duality, the misguided separation and isolation of subject and object. In this karmic creation myth, at some point, a sentient being misperceives, coming to believe that subject, me, and object, my experiences, are entities that exist independently from each other. In truth, how could these ever be separated? As subjects, we never experience ourselves as isolated from the objects of our experience. Perceiver and perceived always exist together. It's a package deal. but we talk as if me and my experience are separate all the time, and we say strange, nonsensical things like, "A funny thing happened to me today," when in fact, nothing just happens to us. This mode of separating ourselves from our experience is a mistake that occurs on a very deep level of consciousness. It is also a mistake sewn into the fabric of our spoken and written language. Built upon the mistake of this duality, other problems begin to unfold. This is the basis for how our materialistic tendencies began in the first place, both personally and societally. Once we believe that me is separate from my experience, that me is a solid entity to whom things happen rather than a fluid part of the unending action, we have to start thinking about defending this isolated, quote-unquote, me against the objects we encounter. Thus, we need some basic strategies for survival. We have to, 1, start pursuing objects that make, quote-unquote, me feel safe and happy. 2, destroying objects that make, quote-unquote, me feel threatened. And 3, ignoring all other objects of experience because the first 2 categories take up all our time and energy. These are the 3 most basic strategies of habitual reaction, also called the 3 root poisons, which in different Buddhist traditions are typically translated as either greed, hatred, and delusion, or passion, aggression, and ignorance. I prefer the translations for these poisonous strategies used by the Buddhist psychologist John Wellwood, who chose to use verbs rather than nouns. Instead of passion, aggression, and ignorance, he called them grasping, rejecting, and desensitizing, respectively. After all, when we apply mindfulness, we experience the present moment more as a verb than as a noun, as an action with the intuitive tone and texture that we can begin to recognize. If we can familiarize ourselves with how these defensive strategies feel, we discover a doorway to understanding our deep-seated patterns of confusion. The important thing in working with karma is to get to the level of awareness through meditation and reflection where we can actually begin to feel these reactions as they arise, and slowly over time develop the wisdom to know what to do when they come about. We have to get to the point where, when we arrive at the block where the bullies used to wait for us, we recognize how we tighten up and begin to walk in another direction, or else freeze. Using verbs removes these 3 confused strategies from the realm of religious commandment and turns them into emotional, embodied experiences we can witness, happening in the present moment, reactions that we can pay attention to as mechanisms of the mind. If we can begin to see how the reactions of grasping, rejecting, and desensitizing actually function in our own mind and body, we will already be a long way toward feeling more at home in our own being, rather than constantly being taken by surprise when our conditioned reactions are triggered. Based on this primary misperception, avidya, and based on the millions of different subcategories of these 3 confused strategies, we develop a particular habitual pattern for responding to similar moments in the future. This is the second step in the cycle of a karmic pattern: habit formation, samskara. These first 2 steps, misperception and the resulting habit formation, prime our mind to respond to situations in the present moment. Back to the 7th grade bullies. Let's say that, arising out of the initial misperception that I needed to always defend the solid, quote-unquote, Ethan against the bullies of experience, that what happened in 7th grade would happen every time I met someone who seemed similarly threatening. Step 1, I developed habitual strategies for how to deal with new bully-like situations Step 2, which then mold my present moment consciousness. Step 3, Vijnana, which becomes embedded in my present mind and body. Step 4, Namarupa, and even predisposes and biases the fields of present sense perceptions based on the past habit. Step 5, Ayatana. Steps 3, 4, and 5, which happen pretty much simultaneously, describe how our mind and body are quote-unquote primed to perceive based on our past karmic experiences. Taken together, they describe the conditioned setup of our consciousness as we face a new experience in the present moment, which is described in steps 6 through 10. What practices are useful in helping us to reflect on our past karma? Forgiveness and gentleness are key. Whether we look at a recent habit like the cigarettes we started smoking last week when things got too stressful, or a longer-term habit like our anxiety around anyone with the same jawline as that old bully, these are strategies that have been slowly ingrained in our consciousness and nervous systems for a long time. For Buddhists, the ancient narrative of reincarnation offers even more support for this forgiving and gentle approach, as long as we don't use it to solidify a story about previous existences. Who cares if I was Cleopatra or Claude Monet or Joe Schmo in a past life? Here's why I think reincarnation might be important. It's an invitation to greatly increase the scope of time in which we got caught up in negative patterns and defensive strategies. If I think a negative thought pattern started only recently, for example, the recurring thought, I suck at writing, that still visits each time I sit down to write, it might be harder to forgive myself for not getting free from those thoughts immediately. But if I think I've been caught in similar patterns for many cycles of consciousness, i.e., the recurring thought, I suck at fill in the blank, reiterating itself as the mind reiterates itself across the expression of many lifetimes, I might give myself a break, which might actually be the most helpful thing for my writing. Again, karma is not just something that we can liberate ourselves from immediately. If we didn't get into our habits quickly, how can we get out of them instantaneously? Of course, some of the most popular spiritual thinkers promise instant transformations of consciousness. Let's face it, the promise of sudden liberation, cutting the chains of stuck karma, is much more marketable than presenting tools for a slow, gradual, lifelong process. It's just a little harder to catch people's attention if what you are saying is, show up to your various practices every day of your life and look for tiny incremental openings in your awareness and behavior, and celebrate those tiny victories. It's also a much more honest approach to transformation. Yes, sudden shifts are always possible, and there are many techniques in Buddhism for purifications of consciousness that might lead occasionally to quick changes, a feeling of clicking into a new sweet spot in how we are approaching our life. But those sudden shifts only come if we have laid the groundwork with quite a lot of contextual understanding and consistent development. I remember being at a workshop with Pema Chodron when she was asked whether the path to awakening was sudden or gradual. She had this wry look on her face as she answered the questioner. Gee, that's funny. I've always thought that sudden was the result of a heck of a lot of gradual. In encountering our past, 2 contemplative meditations we can use involve, first, replacing guilt and shame with a healthy remorse, and second, practicing forgiveness. In this light, the contemplative practices of reflection that involve confronting our past also involve forgiveness and healing. They consist of understanding the complex causes and conditions that led to our current state of confusion, in order to develop compassion toward our own history, as well as toward our familial and societal ancestries. In so doing, the poisonous influences of guilt and shame are slowly replaced with a positive sense of remorse toward our negative habitual patterns. Healthy remorse is what happens when we can honestly acknowledge our own confusion and mistakes along the path, without believing those mistakes somehow doom us. While guilt and shame turn us into frozen, insecure, and incapable beings with no path forward, healthy remorse acknowledges confusion and mistakes with a lightheartedness that actually gives us the means to shift in the present and future. Shame says, I am fundamentally broken, whereas remorse says, I am whole, and yet I've made some mistakes. Guilt says, I can never change, whereas remorse just says, oops. Oops may be my all-time favorite word in the English language, and it's not even a real word. If we aren't willing to make a lot of mistakes, maybe even some big ones, then we aren't really willing to be students of life and students of self-awareness. This has been The Road Home, a contemporary exploration of the Buddhist path, written by Ethan Nichtern, read by Sen Naomi Kirst-Schultz. This is part 1 of chapter 2, Karma.